Thank you for coming this afternoon. This event is a Branigin lecture co-sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Study and the Center on Congress. My name is John Bodner. I direct the Institute for Advanced Study. And to my right over here is Professor Ted Carmines at the Political Science Department, who's the research director for the Center on Congress. The Branigin series brings distinguished lecturers to campus throughout the year. It is made possible by an endowment by Gene Portis, Branigin, who contributed to the Institute for Advanced Study some 25 years ago so that this series could take place. And this year there's been a special focus, despite the variety of speakers, on politics because it was a year of politics with the elections in the fall. So I will turn the program over to Professor Carmines, who will introduce our speaker, Thomas Edsall, today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Well, as John indicated, the Center on Congress and the Institute for Advanced Study have co-sponsored a set of lectures around politics and especially around the 2008 presidential election. Earlier in the fall, we had Robert Dallek, the presidential historian, Gary Jacobson, the specialist on congressional elections, and Charles Franklin, specialist in polling, who came and spoke in this series. And we're culminating that today with Thomas Edsall, who will be speaking on the topic of the politics and economics of American journalism. Thomas Edsall is a political editor of the Huffington Post and the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. From 1981 to 2006, he was a political reporter at the Washington Post, where he covered national politics, including presidential elections, the House and Senate, lobbying, tax policy, demographic trends, social welfare, the politics of race and ethnicity, and organized labor. Prior to working at the Post, Tom reported for the Baltimore Sun and the Providence Journal. He's also contributed television and radio commentary to a variety of outlets, including CNN, C-SPAN, MSNBC, PBS, Fox, and NPR. He's the author of Chain Reaction and Building Red America, two superb books on American politics, and has written extensively for magazines, including the American Prospect, the Atlantic Monthly, Civilization, Dissent, Harper's, The Nation, the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and the Washington Monthly. So I'm delighted to introduce Tom Edsall.
Thank you very much. It is a real honor to be here today. I want to thank both Ted and everyone else who arranged this. I can't say how pleased I am to be speaking after Robert Dallek, Charles Franklin, and Gary Jacobson. They're all people that I depend on regularly. I bombard them with emails for stories for the Huffington Post, and before that for the Washington Post. To be on the same list with them is an honor. Most of all, though, I want to thank Ted Carmines. I owe him a great debt. His 1989 book, Issue Evolution and the Race and the Transformation of American Politics, was crucial to me to gain an understanding of and statistical data, most importantly, showing how race had become politicized in a partisan fashion, starting in a very strong way with the 1964 election. That work became his work, and Jim Stimson, who wrote it with him, became a pillar of my own work. And in my book, Chain Reaction, I ripped it off very thoroughly. But I owe a great debt to Ted and his work since then on all issues, but especially on race with Paul Snyderman and with others is really Indiana is extremely lucky to have Ted here. You may not know it. You may not even like it. I don't know, but you are. The focus of this lecture is on a straightforward question. How do the grim economics of print media and network television and the parallel rise of new media, cable, and the internet influence the coverage of politics and government? In short, to give my answer quickly, the economic decline has made traditional media passive and fearful, and the ascendance of new media has produced two conflicting trends. First, this is the new media. It has uncovered a huge global audience hungry for political news, analysis, and commentary. It's hard to underestimate the range and scope of what especially the web is now reaching, but also cable television. Second, however, it threatens the continuation of a press committed to the pursuit of objectivity. There's a big argument about whether you can be objective, but whether that's a goal of what you're trying to do, and to present news in as neutral a fashion as you can so that the reader can make the judgment, that kind of reporting is threatened. I am arguing that the economic health of a news organization is a powerful factor in the quality of what it produces. Let me go to the tape. The great years in American journalism for many of us in our generation were the early 1970s. This is when the Pentagon Papers were published, first by the New York Times and then by the Washington Post. And this is the time of Watergate. It was also a time when the revenues of both the Washington Post and the New York Times were growing very rapidly. From that period of 71 to 74, the Post had a gain of 46.1%, and the New York Times was doing even better, a gain of 68%. This growth was not stopped right then. It continued, and it continued for decades. In the 80s and 90s, this chart is a little harder to see, but if you look just at the bold-faced words, they're all positive. Rose 32%, a 12.7% increase. Profits grew to a 44% rise. Record first quarter net income. These are taken from random news stories and public announcements by the papers. Revenues rose. What you have basically is these places were rolling in money, and they were quite seriously flush beyond what you could think of. The money was just coming in and coming in. We could travel as a reporter almost anywhere. At the Baltimore Sun, where I worked before this, they actually insisted that when we traveled, we go first class. I remember I went to my first convention in 1972. They gave me a first class ticket down to Miami. I cashed it in, took my wife with me. They also gave $500 in what they basically was walk around money. And this was, if we were at a dinner or anything, the Baltimore Sun picked up the tab. It was basically the rule. That was a lot of money back in 1972, and my wife spent it very effectively. At the time, it seemed that these years would never end. It just looked like it was on, and you can go through annual reports through this whole period. There's some dips, but the stock prices are going up, circulation is going up, ad revenues are going up. And insofar as television was any kind of threat, it just didn't materialize as a threat. It was just another medium, and did not interfere with the continued growth and success of the print media. This euphoria did not last long, however. Let me go here. These two gentlemen, Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark, in April of 1994, founded the Mosaic Corporation, which then soon became Netscape. I don't know how many of you remember that, but that was the first browser that made access to the web available to everybody. It had been quite hard. You could go to the web before that, but it was a real struggle, and you had to, there were nothing like what it is now. Very discomforting and hard process. This event, more than anything, well, yes, probably more than anything else, changed the economics and the structure of the whole media industry in ways that are just, we're still constantly dealing with. Now, let me jump ahead all the way to, we had the Watergate and Pentagon great years of journalism. Let me go to some bad years. In the early part of this decade, I think a very strong case can be made that both the Washington Post and the New York Times did a poor job in the coverage of the lead up to Iraq, the Iraq invasion. It was just not tough, thoughtful, aggressive coverage. You can argue, and I would argue, that it wasn't just weak there. The Bush administration came in, the tax cuts were not examined in a thorough fashion. The policies towards the environment were not examined in a thorough fashion. Who was winning, who was losing. If you recall, when Bush first came in, he had campaigned on a promise to reduce carbon emissions. He dropped that immediately upon winning office. There was none of the kind of tough coverage that was applied to presidents from Clinton to Reagan to Jimmy Carter to Bush Sr. Really, these were not good years. They were, in fact, such bad periods of coverage. In the case of Iraq, both the Times, this is a story from the Times, did a mea culpa story on May 26, 2004, where they described the failings, and this is a front page story for the New York Times to write about itself. The skipping through here, editors at several levels should have been challenging reporters. Accounts of Iraqi defectors were not always weighed against their strong desire to have Saddam Hussein ousted. That was a very devastating report. This was followed relatively soon by a story doing the same thing in the Washington Post in August of 2004. I picked out one quote from it from Tom Ricks, the author of Fiasco, which I would imagine many of you have read, a very good book. And he says the paper was not front paging stuff. Administration assertions were on the front page. Things that challenged the administration were on A18 on Sunday or A24 on Monday. There was an attitude among editors, look, we're going to war. Why do we even worry about all this contrary stuff? Well, all this contrary stuff is just what newspapers traditionally do worry about. And I don't know how much being there was a very discomforting experience as a reporter. And there were stories killed, there were stories. When a newspaper has a very controversial story that looks like it should be on the front page, but plays it on page A17 or A24, every other editor and every television producer is going to look at that and they're going to say, the Post doesn't have much faith in this story. They should have put it out there. They're putting it in the paper because they feel, but they're nervous. So that no one's going to touch it. So good stories that were written by Tom Ricks, by Walter Pincus and others, just never got the traction that you would normally expect a newspaper to have. And instead they weren't even one-day wonders. They were just one-day minor events. Forget the name for those tiny firecrackers, lady fingers or something, used to call them. And that was it. No, they were not cherry bombs. Now, where are we here? I'm not a technological expert. Journalistic passivity in the face of Iraq, I argue, was a manifestation of the beleaguered financial condition of the establishment press. There are a lot of other factors contributing to this. and I don't want to point to a single economic Marxian kind of cause, but, some of the other factors were sui generis to these specific institutions. At the Washington Post, we had a shift from Kay Graham and Ben Bradley to Don Graham and Len Downey as the top people running the company. That shift was like a personality change. I mean, it was very, very significant. At the New York Times, Arthur Sulzberger took over in 1992. He has had a lot of critical magazine coverage of his work, and at any rate, that's all. I don't know much about Sulzberger, so I'm not really in a position to comment on him, but he has not had a good press. There were other inhibitory factors. There was the very successful effort by conservative groups and right-wing think tanks to portray the mainstream press as reflexively liberal. But of all these factors, I think that money has been the least attended to. Corporate profits don't buy courage and integrity, but corporate profits do facilitate the expression of courage and integrity. I mean, this is, I think, a simple fact of life. If you're in trouble at a job, it's much easier to find work while you still have the job than it is when you're laid off and you're at home. Your whole attitude, demeanor, and perhaps a better examination, if you're at a job and you're doing well and on the track up, you're in a great position to look for another job at another company or another college, whatever. Whereas if you're viewed as having problems and you might be people wanting to push you out, you're not you psychologically and in every sort of sense are not in a position to really fight. The same is true with a corporation. When they're on a downhill trajectory, they just don't have the oomph that you need. And in newspapers, part of that oomph is what you would call outrage, or the capacity to be angry, upset, and you lose that capacity when you're getting beaten up. Well, I put it this way here. When you are desperately attempting to hold on to a shrinking circulation base, struggling to cope with lost advertising, and forced to impose layoffs or buyouts on your own staff, you're not equipped psychologically or economically to speak truth to power. Take a look at these next two charts, this is New York Times stock over the past 5 years. It's gone from a little over, close to 50, down, I think today it's at like 446 when I looked at it today. It's 10% of it was just 5 years ago. Take a look at Washington Post stock. It's held up much longer, but it went from 800 at the end of 2008. It's now at about 380, I think. So it's about not as severe, but the only reason it's not as severe is that the Washington Post owns a company that many of you in this room are also very familiar with, the Kaplan place that trains people to take SAT, their law school tests, and it is a money machine in the same way that newspapers used to be. And on the New York Stock Exchange, they no longer refer to the Washington Post as a media company. They now refer to it as an educational and media company. The media is second to the education. And it is basically being carried by Kaplan. I think I just read that the Washington Post reported $25 million in losses at the Washington Post and Newsweek in the last thing, and there's just a process taking place where the revenues are declining as advertisers shift to the web and classified ads, which were the true bread and butter, the page that carried all that was the biggest revenue producer at a newspaper. All those ads are just going to Craigslist. They're going to, what's the one that is the big, I don't know why I'm blanking on it, but anyway, they're going to all these different outlets where they're basically free to everybody. And also they're very good. And you go to Craigslist or you go to some of the, like cars.com or real estate locations, you actually get to see the house or the car you're going to buy. And they'll have multiple photographs and a visual tour of the home and the yard. And the newspapers are just getting crushed by this. And at the same time, they're losing circulation. Young people don't read the paper. I was really surprised. I spoke on a course this morning with about 140 students. Before the class began, 4 of them were reading a newspaper. That's more than classes even at the Columbia School of Journalism, where I teach. And 4 out of 140 ain't, you're not going to make a living off of that. And they're free, I think, here. So when even, that's really bad. When you can't give it away, you got a problem. And they're free at Columbia, too. A recent report on the future of journalism by the Pew Center was very pessimistic in every respect but 2. This is a quote from the report. Some of the numbers are chilling. Newspaper ad revenues have fallen 23% in the last 2 years. Some papers are in bankruptcy and others have lost 3/4 of their value. By our calculation, nearly 1 out of every 5 journalists working for newspapers in 2001 is now gone. And in 2009 may be the worst year yet, probably will be. Local television, in turn, saw revenues fall by 7% in an election year, something unheard of in an election year to actually go down. Normally, the revenues are going down, but then election year comes and you pay extra premium for those ads, and this is a big election year. Well, tons of money was spent on campaigning. They still went down. The same trends dominate the finances of the television networks. Let me show you 2. These are the ratings of the nightly network news shows, ABC, CBS, NBC, from 1980 to 2008. They've gone from over a 50% share, total share of the viewers at that time period, down to just under 25%, a more than 50% decline. And it's a steady decline, and it's just continuing and continuing. This one, the next one shows all viewers, including for the commercial shows. The blue is the network share of the audience. You can see back in 1984, the blue is of the total, it's a good 65% of the total. By the time we get to 2007, 2008, the blue is the pink, which is cable, is now more than the total of blue. If you owned a TV station back in the 80s, it was like owning a newspaper. It was just money came in, and they sold for every year. The price of a TV station would go up. Now they are on the decline, and they're tougher and tougher to sell. And you have to look at these. Often many newspapers own local TVs or TV stations in their own area, some now with the new FCC rules, I believe, and they own them in other, like the Post owns them in Florida, Seattle, I think, a lot of different places. These are not only the paper losing money, but their investments and other publications are losing, or vice versa, depending on how you want to look at it. The Pew study found that the number of Americans who regularly go online for news, though this is the positive side, has jumped 19% in the last 2 years. And in 2008 alone, traffic to the top 50 websites rose by 27%. Pew's commentary on the management of traditional newspapers is deluded by its profitability and fearful of technology, it let others outside the industry steal chance after chance. We have another tense moment right now taking place as some of the traditional media are now trying to rethink the fact that they've allowed aggregators like the Huffington Post to take their news stories, which they paid for, they invested in it, they did the reporting, they did all the work and spent a lot of money doing. Huffington Post and others can just get the link to the story, post it on its website, gets readers who in the value structure have more value than what happens next is you go to the Huffington Post, then you click on that story and you go to the New York Times, but it's a secondary step, not as good as the first step to the Huffington Post, and chances are you're going to go back, your next step will be back to the Huffington Post, not to more on the New York Times. We, meaning the Huffington Post, have made are looking like, we certainly increased in value. It's not clear if we make any money or not. But the value of the Huffington Post has grown radically, basically by stealing from everybody who's there, making available all these free stories. Everybody produces what are free stories, and no one figured out a way to monetize those stories as a web product early on. What does all this mean for the quality of political coverage? A great deal. On the positive side, the two growth media, cable and the internet, have both tapped into, as I say, what is unquestionably an enormous market for this kind of news. On cable, the three industry leaders, Fox, MSNBC, and CNN, all view political government news as their bread and butter. And that's what they produce, they comment on, they report on, they analyze. It's just constant there. On the internet, if you look at the 100 top blog sites, the top 6 of the top 10 are explicitly political. 26 of the top 50 are political, and 38 of the top 100 are political. This suggests that there is just a huge demand for this kind of information. People want to know what's going on. At the Huffington Post, it's interesting, everyone thought that we had a huge surge during the election. It was just everyone wanted to know what was going on, first with Obama and Hillary, then with Obama and McCain, and the traffic line was going straight up towards November 4th. We thought we're going to have a big fall off come November 5th. The fact is the traffic line is not quite as accelerated, but it's still going up, and I'll show you in a few minutes that line. But with the economic crisis and with the Obama in power governing, the interest in the news remains apparently even higher, or more unique visitors are coming every month. In fact, the next slide I have is just, oops, what happened here? Did I lose it? Oh, this is another slide that I had not numbered in my thing, but this shows you on the left is cable, this is growth, and the bottom, that middle line there, or where it goes across, is 0. Cable has grown by, looks like about 38% in 2008. The internet grew, I believe they said at 27%. Audio, which I guess is radio, which I thought had been doing worse, actually they say is doing better. I'm surprised by that. But then after that, everyone is on the negative side. Network, local TV, newspapers, and magazines. Here's a list of the top 10 blog sites. And there's Huffington Post right at the top. But just to note this, of the top 6 that are political, 4 of them are explicitly ideological to a certain degree. Huffington Post is liberal. The Corner is put out by the National Journal, by the National Review. It's conservative. Think Progress is liberal. The first 3 are all either liberal or conservative. The next 2 are, let's call them neutral, CNN and ABC, and then the number 9 is Michelle Malkin, who's a conservative. So it's, I would get some other stuff to say about that in a minute. In many respects, you can say, even with all their lost circulation, ad revenue, and so forth, newspapers are, here's the Huffington Post monthly viewers. You can see a year ago they were at 2 million, way over there. They're now up to over 6.5 million. These are unique, different people who come at least once every month. If you can, but here's Washington Post. Their circulation has been falling. They used to be very close to 1 million a day in terms of paid circulation. They're now, I think, at around 800 to 750, a 25% drop in circulation. But they had, at the beginning of this 12-month period, just under 8 million, and they're now at just over 8 million on the web. Their total consumption is much higher than what had been the case. The New York Times is even is pretty. Look at these guys. They've gone from 13.5 million up to well over 16.5 million. That's a lot of people to be reading any publication. They also have, I think, one of the better websites that you're going to find with very effective use of slideshows, videos, and they've also gotten into the blog business. I think there are 40 separate blogs on the New York Times on from subjects from food to economics, which is a big pull. Another significant positive thing emerging from this is that the web can be, isn't always, but can be very responsive to crises. From the obvious things like an earthquake, where you get news fast and information comes in from people who were there. They send in videos, they send in pictures, they send in reports, or all kinds of sort of natural disasters. But what's really striking is that if you look at the economic crisis we've been going through, it has produced a flowering of very good economics blogs. Academics who are very prominent in the field run blogs where they are posting almost daily on events, so that if you want to get a range of views, there are going to be a lot of differences, but on Geithner's bank rescue plan, on all the TARP program, the economic stimulus, all this, there is expert commentary available now in a much wider range. And these guys, economics people, love to hate each other. And they will say terrible things, but you see the argument. And they will try to make their argument on an intellectual basis. They'll probably just say, Krugman is an idiot, he doesn't see this, it's like an elephant in a room, and you can't believe what he's saying because X, Y, and Z. Then Krugman comes back and says, I see that, and you just can discount it because X, Y, and Z. Anyway, you can see a very useful, and at least I have found, and as a reporter, it's provided access to the debate in a very substantial way. I've been very impressed with that. But there are some severe problems that also come up with this. One is the polarization. I mentioned about how 4 of the top 6 blogs are very politicized in the sense that they're liberal or conservative. Take the cable, though. There's Fox on the right, MSNBC on the left, and CNN more or less in the center, although the right would say it's a lefty thing, but it's really much more centrist than either of the other two. CNN had been a dominant place for viewers to go to. Then Fox surged forward. This last month, March, for the first time, CNN came in third. So what you have are the 2 left and right cables networks beating the one that you could best describe as being the objective centrist news publication. This is not a, if you want objective news as part of your diet, this is not a good thing to be happening. Because of economics. Being number 1 is very important. Being number 2 is being important. Being last is terrible in the way economics and the way people will make calculations on where they're going to put their ad money, especially. So for CNN to be coming in third has consequences more than just being third. It means it's going to lose money over time, and the money is going to flow to Fox and MSNBC. The other problem is more internal. If you run a website now, you can find out instantly how much viewership every single story on your website is drawing, literally by the hour, by 6 months, by 12 hours, I mean not 6 months, 6 hours. So an editor running a news site and reporters writing for it are going to think, what makes the money for this website? It's the clicks, the number of people that go to it. That's how they sell ads in a basic sense. The stories then that draw the clicks are going to get the best play, and the stories that don't draw the clicks are going to be the ones they discard the fastest. I believe a lot of Gannett chains now give out daily reports to their entire staff listing all the stories and how many web clicks. They're very concerned about their web position. So if you're in the city room of one of these papers, you look at that every day. Whether you're an editor, a reporter, or whatever, you're going to get news judgments based on clicks, is what I'm saying. And what it means is you're going to get a lot of stories about people who find starving dogs on the roadside, and many fewer stories on the property tax rate, the city hall activities, and I don't think many people in this room would particularly like this trend. And what is really likely to get hurt are, at the local level, are investigative stories. The role of the local paper, keeping an eye on City Hall, keeping an eye on the governor's office, the state legislature. That one is very costly, takes time, you're not producing many stories, and 2, those stories don't get all that many hits. And the economics are going to drive not a healthy situation at that level. In fact, all of this all matters because we are now at a moment where a lot of the world seems to be going to hell. You got the economic crisis, you've got the Middle East, you've got Pakistan, you've got North Korea, Eastern Europe, Iran, all that, and you got rioting in some places with the potential for violence, a very volatile situation. And the 2 areas that are most vulnerable for declining coverage are, one, what I already described, the local news, but 2, foreign affairs reporting. That's very expensive to maintain a bureau, and it's even much more expensive to maintain a bureau in a war zone, which costs a fortune because of the services you have to have provided and the protection you have to provide your own staff. The media are a crucial source of information on which everyone bases many policy decisions. It is a conduit that is crucial in this whole process. And the traditional media, basically, I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the networks, are the only places that are equipped with the huge staffs, the resources that you need to do this kind of reporting, and a commitment to portray what they see and report on in what they believe, at least, to be a fair and accurate fashion. The ascendant new media, including the Huffington Post, is not equipped to do this, nor is cable equipped to do this. And they don't have the revenue streams yet to anywhere near approach being able to fill this gap. On that pessimistic note, let me end this. I would really like to hear your questions and thoughts, and you can ask me anything you want, abusive questions about the Huffington Post, whatever. Go ahead.
You talk about the 4 of those top 6 of the top 10 being ideological sites, and 2 more ideologically leaning cable networks now having higher ratings than CNN, which is presumably more centrist, as possibly a bad thing if objective journalism is something to be valued. On the other hand, the practice of objective journalism often becomes simply one side says this and one side says that, as if they're of equal value, and much of the intellectual rigor that you get and the respect for facts that you get in an ideological news outlet that's not necessarily bound by this side, that side, is actually more informative. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
To some extent, I agree with you, but I think it's become more informative in part because of what I was referring to at the beginning of the lecture, the passivity that has begun to overtake the traditional journalism. I may be fantasizing that my youth were greater times than what we got today, like all people my age do. But I think the spirit, when I went to work first at the Providence Journal and the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Times, there was a real sense of purpose and a capacity. The Washington Post, for example, was great in the sense that it had a capacity for outrage. That's I think, a very important ingredient. And that the public liked that, I think. And that you'd have surveys saying, we want more investigative reporting and that kind of work. And I remember working under Ben Bradley, and this was way back in 1981, and Congress, with the new Congress, under Reagan and the Republicans had taken over the Senate, they passed a provision allowing corporations to buy and sell tax breaks so that you could, if you were a rich company making a lot of money, you could buy, like from Chrysler or GM, tax breaks. So they would make money and you could eliminate your whole tax liability. Because Chrysler and General Motors, the tax breaks were useless because they had no profits against which to write off these tax breaks. And then we had the recession. So people were really pissed off about this. With Ben Bradley came, and I happened to luck out to be the reporter in this, and he said, in fact, Warren Buffett told him, of all people, he said, this is outrageous, it's crazy. And Ben Bradley said, go for it. And so when it was just all worked out time-wise perfectly. Annual reports came out very soon, and you saw very rich companies like General Electric and a lot of oil companies with zero tax owed. And the unemployment rate was fast approaching 10.1%. Great story. Bang. The whole tone and tenor at the Washington Post has changed. And now what they call it is accountability journalism. That's very different than being, one, to be accountable, there has to be some rule you are breaking or law. It's not just outrageous on its face. That's not enough. It's got to be, you promised in your campaign you were going to do this, now you're not doing it, or the rules don't let you under the Federal Election Campaign Act. There has to be some sort of objective standard against which you, as a journal, put them to their accountability. That's a very different tone and tenor, and it's much more cautious ultimately. I think what papers do turn to more and more when they get fearful is this either-or journalism. So at the extreme, it's reporting that you can't see China because of the horizon, although some people argue that you'll fall off the world if you keep going towards China, as if there was an equal degree of parallel. All right, go ahead.
So I think your point about investigative journalism as sort of this thing to be valued is clearly valid. But you look at this sort of distributed search for information that is occurring when you have so many people participating and being able to broadcast information, and you look at like Talking Points Memo. I think they broke or worked on the attorney filings, which is pretty huge. And so human rights abuses. You can, one person says something that virally, it spread. But traditional journalism clearly, when you have, whether or not it's a professionalization issue, but when you have somebody who dedicates themselves to like really the networking and the fact finding, and just the trudging through the documents to get really deep. How can we find a balance between, you're a professional journalist working for the Huffington Post, between this sort of classic journalism where it's just somebody who's paid to dig deeply, and marrying that with this very powerful, City Hall's dicking you around, you write about it on the internet, and if people are outraged, it spreads. Somebody steals your cell phone. These are two strengths, and they're not mutually exclusive. How can we use them both?
Well, there may be some trends towards moving in that direction. What Talking Points Memo did with the Attorney General, this was the U.S. attorneys who were fired, they're one of their big stories. They, in fact, though, to some extent, there was an odd marriage taking place. The McClatchy chain, which is very troubled and very beleaguered and really does not fit my image because they're on the ropes financially, but they have maintained this principled journalism reporting. But no one reads them in Washington. They have papers in all outside, mostly in California, where they were doing some very good work. And Talking Points Memo did some work on its own, but they also were able to pass on the news from McClatchy as new news to most readers. And the third thing they did was they developed citizen sources, so that if something happened in Minneapolis, I think that was where one of these U.S. attorneys was, their constituents would write in or email in to Josh Marshall, the editor of Talking Points Memo. They have a model that a lot of people want to build on. It's still, they had a good run with that, and they had another good story, I forget the subject though, that they did quite well on. He won a big journalism prize, the Sigma Delta Chi or some award, for the first time going to a web-based site. But I'm not sure that one, he's had trouble sustaining that, and two, this is all in the formative stage, and because there is such a huge market for information and news, you can expect somehow people are going to figure out how to make it work and how to make a profit from it. But it hasn't happened yet. I mean, we were talking at lunch, does the Huffington Post is the top blog? I'm not sure that it makes money. I don't know. I don't think so. But people are investing in it, and they're putting a lot of money. Someone just invested $25 million in it, a venture capital fund. After the economic downturn had begun, when no venture capital money was around, somebody said, we're going to put 25 million bucks in this. It's like betting on the come on that you're going to win down the line. It's really, and the Huffington Post is trying very hard to develop citizen journalism, and the other thing they have got done, but I don't think this is a good model personally, is foundation money to support a big investigative based journalism. The problem with getting foundation money is foundations tend to be run by very rich people whose attention span is about the length of a squirrel's. And they'll be big on investigative journalism today. Tomorrow it will be refugees from Nicaragua. And the day after tomorrow will be inner city schools. And you get a grant for a year and then bye. It's just a problem. But it's a good question. I obviously don't have an answer. Go ahead.
Well, we're clearly seeing a business model transition on more horse-drawn carriages to automobile. And it's very typical that the disruptive technology is not embraced and used by the old providers of the service and by entirely new companies that embrace the new technology and moving forward. And we're in this really rocky in-between period where we have some really good aspects of the old-style journalism that we don't want to lose, and we also have some good aspects of the new stuff, and good and bad of both. And I really think in the long run, it'll all sort itself out. There will be a market for good investigative journalism. There will be a way to finance it, but it has to be separated from the business of cutting down trees and using energy to move those dead trees around in the form of paper. That's
well, no question. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So
producing on a website is much cheaper than cutting down
yeah,
trees.
that's what I never hear. So the Washington Post, how much money do they spend collecting the news? How much money do they spend on paper, moving paper around?
Way too much. I mean,
so is it, you know,
I mean, you can't afford it.
80% of their costs or 20%? I never hear that number.
It's a good question. I think it's probably available. There's an argument. My wife made me promise not to use these pictures because they were too childish, she said, but this is what the Washington Post allowed itself to be put into, was basically, but that may be a healthy model. It's creative destruction, and the bird's has had it, but maybe the snake has the model. Another way to look at it, and this is a pigeon outside a window, and the cats are all the media, the old media. At any rate, we can go even farther. Here's the. All right. At any rate, that's enough of that. But the problem is that the cat and the snake and the pigeon don't yet have the model to replace their adversaries in this, and we are in a transition period. And you're quite right that there is this, and that's what I've been arguing all through this, is that there's this huge appetite and hunger for information, news, and there is evidence of it. I mean, it's not just somebody in fantasy mouthing off. The rise of the political websites, of the cable TV, and their focus on politics means people want it. And it's not just liberal academics at Indiana University and Columbia. It's all over the place. Go ahead.
I listen to Amy Goodman on the radio, and she picks up people all over the country, all over the world, young, bright, voices that I never hear anywhere else. I don't know how much money she's working with. She travels all over. It's phenomenal. How does she do it? And why don't we have more of this? And it's so...
She has foundation money. I mean, I think she's not a market-based, she has someone financing her. And she has found, presumably, and I don't mean this critically, but she has found a liberal donor or donors willing to support what she does. Because like you, they like very much what her product is.
Voices that you hear, no, an
Yeah.
authoritative voice.
But there is not an economic model yet for that.
One more question.
Well, the New York Times for a while did charge people to use their websites, at least to get the full articles. And then they went away from that, but there's an article today suggesting that they're going to go back to charging, or they're thinking of doing it. Do you know how much they make on the advertisements on their websites, or? You know?
They're increasing, but it's nowhere, as I understand it, their losses on the print side far outweigh the gains that but there's a lot of talk about trying to figure out a new model, and I'm not an expert on this, but it's one more where you would agree, and probably all the papers would have to do this at once, and I don't know how from an antitrust paper, because you can't have one paper starting to charge and others not, because you're not going to keep going to it. But charge a quite small amount somehow, and there are programs that equip you to do this. So you'd pay like 2 cents for every article that you went to, or 1.8 cents, or some small cost, and it would go on your credit card. And this would apply to all journalism, maybe. And somehow they would set this up. You'd have to agree to put your credit card into some bank. But people do this all the time on the web now. But as I say, after they let the cat out of the bag by allowing free access, to go back is a hard step. And that's what the New York Times found it to be, a bad step. The only place that succeeded in doing this, that's Wall Street Journal did, but they have a product that has real value added to its consumers. People's bottom lines are defined by what's on that website. I mean, people will need that information, just like Bloomberg has these terminals that people pay $20,000 a year for, because there is information there that will affect what they make. The Post and New York Times don't have that kind of information. So you have to have a much smaller way of, I think, just, and I don't know, there are people working on this very subject. How they're going to do it and whether it will work, I don't know.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.